Hello and welcome back to the Agent of History podcast. I am Joel, your fellow traveller on this journey, a journey into two questions of how did we break and how do we heal. This podcast is part two of an interview with Rabbi Jeff Roth. In part one of the interview, Rabbi Jeff used the framework he's developed that explores the evolution of human consciousness to interpret the words of the book of Genesis, the first book in the Torah, to help us uncover some answers to the question of how did we break. And in this second part, Rabbi Jeff focuses on the book of Exodus, the second book in the Torah, to again explore answers to the question of how do we heal. So if you haven't heard the first part of this interview with Rabbi Jeff, I really strongly recommend you check that out first. But that's not in any way necessary, and you're very welcome, of course, to just enjoy this second part of the interview where we explore the question of how do we heal. So without any further ado, this is the second part of my interview with Rabbi Jeff Roth.
Okay, nice to see you again, Joel.
Okay, yes, thank you, Rabbi Jeff Roth, for coming back for part two of this wonderful conversation, framed by these two questions: how do we break and how do we heal? And maybe we could begin by just doing a little summary of the answer that we gave so far to the first question, how do we break, based on your understanding of the book of Genesis, and we can then move into the second question.
Yeah, so by the question we, the word we in that question means human beings. And what I spoke with you about last time was even before we get into what the Jewish take on that is, and how you could see the same story playing out in the book of Genesis, was that at some point the species Homo sapiens learned speech and language. It wasn't inherent in the creation. Those beings, Homo sapiens, were around for 150,000 years, something like that, before what seemed like that they acquired speech and language. And just like a baby who's born, it's not an inherent thing in a baby that they know how to speak. You have to teach a baby how to speak. So the whole species had to sort of slowly develop that ability and then start teaching it. And so most people think that didn't start until 30,000 years ago. So after 150,000 years after the species appears on the planet. With the arising of speech and language and conceptual thinking, that caused a fundamental rift. I think that's the fundamental break that, at least one way to explain what is the break that you're looking into. And that break was a fundamental misperception that we would call the dualistic misperception that came out of the results of the brain of Homo sapiens becoming organized around the operating system of speech and language, because concepts are inherently dualistic. In order for a concept to mean anything, there's to sort of be a boundary around some aspect of experience, some aspect of reality that says this is this, and it's not the whole rest of the universe. So every concept sort of coexists with not that concept. Everything outside the tree is not the tree, and so it was a tremendously helpful technology to have speech and language, but the side effect was the basic misperception, the dualistic misperception. And out of the dualistic misperception, then human beings began to have a sense of a separate self, separate from other human beings, separate from other beings on the planet. And the consequence of that is the operating system for most human beings is run by selfishness. Self-centered, selfish, self-serving, most of which is appropriate, but not all of it. And it's appropriate for an individual, a so-called individual being, getting what they need. But it doesn't address the fundamental true nature of things that everything is.
It reminds me, actually, I think it's from my learning from the Sefer Yetzirah, which is like the oldest known kind of Kabbalistic text that describes good and evil as a dimension, and so this is really intriguing me, especially if we want to get beyond judgment, which is inherently a feature of conceptual language, that good and evil as a dimension. And then you said the last time you said was something about that the dualistic conceptualizing that we do takes us ever further away from the inherent truth of our reality, which in a way you could be saying takes us towards evil, not in a judgmental sense of evil, but in this notion that good and evil are dimensional in terms of how they relate to the essential truth of reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I think what we call evil is an outcome of this misperception.
Right. Okay.
So, if I'm separate from you, then I'm much less responsible for what's going on in your life. I'm only responsible for what's going on in my life, as if your life and my life are two separate things, but they aren't. Not, at least not completely. To some degree, they are in practical terms. They are, and they are in some ways. But what we're seeing on the planet is that if we don't pay attention to the interrelationship of all things, human beings wind up treating other human beings in a really awful way, and that's we're going to get to that with a Jewish metaphor of slavery in Egypt. But people are still enslaving other people, and enslaving the planet and the other creatures of the planet, using all of those things in a self-serving way, which is destroying the planet. So,
and if I may add, also
great rift in how the planet usually works.
And fundamentally enslaving ourselves, because as we in so many ways through our dualistic thinking. So that was part one, and that was the bet story. How the first letter of the Torah in the book of Genesis is the bet, but the story of how we heal is or there are two, I think, Aleph stories that you want to share with us. Yeah. They come from the book of Exodus, I believe.
All right, so what I added on top of this, because up until now we haven't said why is this a particular Jewish approach. But the story in Genesis of the exile from the garden seems to quite parallel this idea that human beings develop speech and language, and good and evil. Like good and evil doesn't exist until we eat from that tree of knowing of good and evil. And so eating from the tree of knowing of good and evil in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, is, you could say, the equivalent of taking on the nature of seeing things through the lens of good and bad, right and wrong, me and you, separation. So that story happens. Now, where we're heading is a theology that I would say is an inevitable, mystical evolution that was eventually going to arrive because of some fantastic way of re-understanding the nature of the universe that appears in the book of Exodus. That you could say, from a Jewish point of view, the key moment are the stories of Sinai. That's at Mount Sinai, the revelations at Mount Sinai. In the Jewish world, that's internally understood as the key event of Jewish history, was the revelation at Sinai. But I would say that revelation is hinted at in Torah. Something happened that is hinted at, even as either metaphorically as a story about something that happened in the past, or it's hard to say what the historical aspect of that is. But it's a story. It's an old story in any case. And that story led to a radically different theology. But it took a couple thousand years for that radical different theology to arrive. Even the Sefer Yetzirah, this book you mentioned, comes about in the Common Era in terms of dating, and 1,000 years after the events, so to speak, at Mount Sinai. Certainly 1,000 years after the story of Mount Sinai arose. That story is that much older than that book of mysticism, and that the Sefer Yetzirah actually picks up on a different aspect than the creation of speech and language. It actually picks up on what happened when writing came in. Writing made the separation nature of language even stronger. Yeah. And so then a mysticism arose early on in Judaism that was letter mysticism. But there were no letters originally. Words didn't have letters. Letters are a later development. But once they came about and writing came about, then mystics picked up on the writing and the letters. So that's what that book is about. But what happens in the book of Exodus is a revelation that turns things around in terms of how to see the world, which 2,000 years after the book of the Sefer Yetzirah is going to, or 1,500 years later, is going to evolve into a Jewish mystical theology that I mentioned last time, that everything is God and nothing but God. And everything God is nothing but God is I think was a completely natural evolutionary consequence of the teaching that appears at Mount Sinai, even though at the time it appeared, it wasn't understood that way. It took 1,500 years for this way of thinking to be seen differently, but it was sort of an inevitable outcome of a particular way that the divine was understood. The nature of theology, of Jewish theology, shifted at Mount Sinai. It shifts in the sense that God, so to speak, gets a new name. By the time you get to this development, everything is God, nothing but God, we're not talking about a name anymore. We're talking about everything. Everything is everything. You could call it everything. There's no separate God because God's everything. So there's just everything. But it's a theology of interconnectivity. It's a theology of the oneness of the unfolding of being. That language, the unfolding of being, is the language that gets hinted at already. That the nature of the divine takes on a new revelatory meaning at the event at Mount Sinai. So what happens? And it's the story, the way the Bible tells the story, is intentionally told as a story of what's the way out, the Exodus. What's the way out of the problem? And it starts with Moses. The experiences at Sinai start first with Moses at the burning bush. So Moses, just to remind everybody, is besides the fact that he is understood as the singular most key prophet in the Jewish tradition, Moses was a baby born at the time of slavery in Egypt, when there was a decree. You were coming right up to Passover in a week. So the decree went out that lest the slaves get too powerful, let's kill the boy baby, the new boy babies that are going to be born. And so Moses is under a death sentence. Luckily, the proto-feminists of the Bible, the Jewish midwives, saved the day by not obeying it's a civil disobedience, an act of civil disobedience, which is done by women. So it's sort of an exciting story on that level. Anyways, they saved the baby Moses. Most people know the story. He gets put in a basket. He gets found by the daughter of the Pharaoh. The daughter of the Pharaoh takes him in as her child, and so Moses is raised in the court of Pharaoh, and as a prince of Egypt, the grandson of the Pharaoh of Egypt. So, and Moses sees this taskmaster. He knows he's Hebrew because he's wet nursed by his real mother. Anyways, so he knows he's part of that tradition as well, the slave culture there. And when he sees a taskmaster killing a slave, he kills the taskmaster, hurting a slave. He kills the taskmaster, and then he realizes he has to flee Egypt. So he leaves Egypt, and he leaves all of his conditioning behind, the world he grew up in, and he goes and becomes a shepherd in Midian, according to the story in the Bible. And that's when the burning bush story takes place. And in the story of the burning bush, Moses is finally ready to face his past. I would say that's what's happening. He's out in the wilderness and he sees something he hasn't seen before, a bush that's burning, but that bush is a thorn bush according to tradition. The way I would interpret it, many people interpret it, that Moses actually sort of woke up to the fact that he had to do something about where he came from, that this was his personal destiny. So somehow or another, a divine voice starts to speak in him and through him. For those people who saw the Cecil B. DeMille version of the Ten Commandments, when Charlton Heston is playing Moses and appears at the burning bush, and the bush starts speaking to Moses, the voice of the divine speaks to Moses. Charlton Heston's voice is the voice of the divine speaking to Charlton Heston as Moses. And so it's already a midrash suggesting that Moses heard from his own inner understanding, he heard something divine unfolding. So here's the key part of the divine unfolding. The name and the way to refer to the divine, which is a brand new introduction at Sinai. The text even says no. In the past, the earlier generations didn't know the divine by this name, this appellation. Comes through, and the name itself in Hebrew is a linguistic formulation at the core of which is the Hebrew verb to be. So all of a sudden, a new revelation enters human consciousness, at least with this story, that what God is. The verb to be is. That's what God is somehow related to the isness of the universe. That God's had all sorts of other names before. They had names that sort of referred to mountains and names, all the names that have the word El in them.
Like mine.
Seem to be related to trees, like alone is a tree. So and we have the trees from the Garden of Eden. So there's a lot of tree imagery. El Shaddai is the mountain god. And now all of a sudden we have a God of being. God has to do with the verb to be. And then
so God, in a way, but God to emphasize this, God goes from being a noun to a verb.
Right, exactly. If we took that away even from the theology for a minute, like last time we were talking about as a root concept, the concept of a tree. So if a tree becomes a verb, then that's actually closer to the truth. Treeing is happening. So part of the universe is limiting itself into an activity that you could call treeing, and it's alive, it's unfolding, it's treeing, and then it's done treeing. Now it's back in the soil. Now it's back in the air. So treeing is a verb. In some ways, that would be a good corrective to how to work with language. If we start understanding, language as being more verbs and less nouns. And apparently, I am not a linguist, but apparently there are some languages that are much more heavily verbal and English happens to be heavily focused on nouns, and many languages are. But apparently, there are some languages that are more verbal, that sort of capture the flowing of things. So God is a verb. A tree is a verb. Everything's a verb. Everything is God, nothing but God, which is the unfolding of being. So, but this idea of being enters the central Jewish theology. Now, one of the things I think is really interesting that we can get that's sort of specific to that story is that there are two different ways to refer to being that come in that story. And probably be helpful if we had a chart to show, especially those people who are not Hebrew speakers, the name that everybody knows more and that is officially called a name, even in that story, has the four letters Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey. Some people who aren't familiar with Hebrew but may have heard it referred to as Jehovah, although that's probably not how those letters would have been pronounced, but it does contain those letters. So the English consonants would be Y, H, V, and H for the letters Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. That in the story is said. The story says this is God's name forever and ever. But that name Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey appears after the whole story itself of what happened with Moses. So Moses is at the bush. He starts to hear the bush speaking. I would suggest that means now he's in the territory of somehow direct connection to the divine unfolding, sort of awake to the divine unfolding. And there's a very important word from a Jewish perspective that appears as soon as the voice starts to speak, or he starts hearing this voice at the bush. The first thing it says is, now you're in holy territory. Take your shoes off because this is holy territory. And this word holy is only the second time in the Torah that the word holy appears. It's only used one other time in the book of Genesis, and that is to refer to the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is holy. So there's the 6 days of creation, of doing, and making. And then there's a day when even the divine, so to speak, in this metaphoric story, doesn't do anything, but instead rests from doing. And that's what's called sacred. Holy. It's called holy because it's a day for reflecting. It's a day for being with what is. And it's a day for being rather than doing. That's one of the oldest ways of understanding the Sabbath in the Jewish tradition. And that's what's called holy. Being is holy, not doing. Doing was called good. All the first 6 days of what God did was good, but only the reflection on what is and not doing, being is holy. And then because Genesis is this story of murder and what went wrong, the word holiness does not appear again until this story at the burning bush. After this story at the burning bush, holiness becomes the central word of Judaism. The whole point of Judaism, you could say, is to be holy because the divine is holy and we should be a holy people. And the word holy appears endlessly after that in the Torah. Every section that read every week mentions the word holiness. The whole purpose of the Jewish people is really to become a sacred, a holy people, and to act in a holy way, and to see the world as a holy world. Fundamental insight that comes through it, that God is a verb. Not that God is a verb, that God is somehow related to the verb to be. That even the name is a form of the verb to be. But nevertheless, Yud He Vav He then is understood as a name for the divine. It's not God, God's self. It's a name for God. So by the time Yud He Vav He gets pointed out in that story, I think it's in verse 15 of chapter 3 of Exodus, it follows 4 times a different way of referring to the divine than Yud He Vav He, which is in English, the way you pronounce it, you say Ehiyah. And it's very close. It's the same verbal form, the same root word as the verb to be that's in Yud He Vav He. Only there's a really important grammatical thing to know about Hebrew, which will make the revelation even more clear. So in Yud He Vav He, the verb to be part is the last 3 letters. The Yud is a prefix in Hebrew. So Hebrew words by and large have 3-letter roots. And then the extra letters above that flex the root in certain directions. So when you add a Yud to the verb to be, at the beginning, it changes the verbal form into the 3rd person masculine. So once you add a Yud to the verb to be, now you're talking about a name for God, which is going to refer to a he. It's a he name for God. And it's an out there name, because the 3rd person is out there. And so then Yud He Vav He, even though it's still the verb to be, would probably be something closer to he is the one who causes being to be. Because there's a causative form in Hebrew as well, by the way the sounds get added to the consonants. So, okay, then God is the external being who has a name, and the name says he is the one out there who caused all this being to be. Okay, but that's the name that was given in that story. But there's a different way to understand the divine that appears 4 times before the name to call the divine Yud He Vav He, and that's Ehiyah. So Ehiyah would be the Hebrew letters Aleph, He, Yud, He. So again, the last 3 letters are again a form of the verb to be. The Aleph prefix in Hebrew is a prefix that changes the root meaning of the word to be in the 1st person singular, as opposed to the 3rd person masculine. The 1st person in Hebrew doesn't have a gender. So in the third person, you can say he or she. In the first person in Hebrew, there's no difference between a male saying I am, or a female saying I am. The word comes out the same way. So the ehia is a even in terms of gender, is non-dualistic. It's a singular gender. It's also being the first person is not out there. So if the real essence of the divine is ehia as opposed to yud hey vav hey, then the divine is the internal first person experience of the universe. So it's sort of being aware of its own being, and there's only one. There's only one being aware of its own beingness. That was the natural seed that Jewish mystics were going to eventually develop this formula: everything is God, nothing but God. But it was sort of lost for a while. The mystics had to uncover that because the text, which was written at a time where God was out there, and probably written by men who thought of God as a he out there who made the world, a masculine maker of the world, they emphasize his name Yud Hey Vav Hey, even though the other word ehia appears 4 times in the same section before the line that comes out, and so Yud Hey Vav Hey will be God's name forever and ever. But the actual revelation, the actual experience of the revelation was an internal experience of I am, ehia. Oh, I am the unfolding of being. I am the one unfolding of being. And
so where are we? So obviously, in terms of this question of how do we heal?
Good.
Obviously, so what we're moving towards is an answer that is suggesting, or more than suggesting, that we need to move away from this, the dualistic conceptualizing, to understand that it's not doing, but it's being. It's present. It's being present. It's being present to the unfolding of being. Is that?
It's an internal waking up. I think the healing comes with an internal waking up to the fact that when I usually think of I am me, but it's not that. Me is a story that when one practices. So the practice I'm interested in is the direct paying of attention, awakened attention to what's happening right now. When one usually is, all of us are usually involved in thinking about what's happening right now, which is a different experience completely than noticing what's happening right now. Noticing what's happening right now is observing through the power of consciousness, the unfolding of being. Concepts are thinking about that, and now you can reflect on what you saw, and you can change it into concepts. But the healing that I think you're trying to get at is in shifting enough of our time away from thinking into the practice of resting in the sense of the I am of the universe, busy knowing and seeing and observing, as opposed to doing, and as opposed to being the subject of the language. Instead, there's a direct seeing how language is happening, thoughts are happening. Thoughts are really downplayed. There's another place that has an interesting reference Jewishly. So the healing comes by observing rather than thinking, including eventually you have to really be able to observe the thinking process from the outside place of an observer, rather than from the place of being the thinker. And thinking is, let me just say something about Judaism and thinking and Torah. So the word to think, it's a word, thinking is referenced in the Torah, and the first time the word thinking is referred to in Torah, it's part of a line that says, all the thoughts of the heart of a person are evil all the time, from childhood on. So thinking in Torah is quite frequently associated with the word evil. You actually see the word to think and the word evil in the same sentence. The basic sense of thinking from a Torah point of view is like scheming, conniving. Thinking is a self-serving, selfish process. not highly appreciated. I mean, it has to do with evil thinking. Yeah, that's that stuff. So thinking is not going to be the way to get out of the problem. Thinking is going to leave us lost in the delusion of separateness, busy conniving and scheming, and that will perpetuate the brokenness. Resting in the awakened consciousness of being, because being itself, I would say the universe itself has a sentient nature, that we can rest in the quality of knowing and attending. That's also a function of existence, that there's a consciousness that goes along with existence. And the healing comes when we take our place in the knowing of this unfolding, rather than as a thinker thinking these things, which is going to stay self-serving. We don't have to get rid of thinking. We just have to be able to enhance the ability to notice the process of thinking and not always be lost as the thinker.
So it makes me, there's two things that I'm thinking about. It makes me wonder whether the question as I frame it is slightly, it could be enhanced linguistically from how do we heal, because we heal is still a doing, to something like how do we open ourselves to the possibility of healing, or something like that. So healing becomes a becoming, an unfolding, rather than kind of an active doing. Is that?
Yeah, I think it happens because when one pays attention, I mean, paying attention is a kind of action too.
Yeah.
But so, but paying attention, it's not like we have to work at stopping doing bad things. If we pay attention, the misperception, the more we pay attention, the more the misperception will fade away. And then the root cause of the doing things that we would call evil, the root cause of that will disappear, because the root cause is the fundamental misperception. So by paying attention, it will naturally result in different actions. Something different will come out of that, because the root cause of why evil started in the first place will shift. Instead of we fundamentally want the healing that I see is to move past the misperception.
I'd like to ask you also about the role of Egypt here, because so on one hand we've got Egypt, which is like the enslavement of the people of Israel in Egypt is like the rock bottom point of their process, their fall, that began in the from the exit or their being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and it ends at this low point as slaves in a foreign land. But I also learned that this word Egypt in Hebrew is Mitzrayim, which like literally means in the narrow place, or in the place of contraction. So it's really like I point to my chest. I do that, like a place, this place of suffering that when we're in a place of contraction, we're in a place of suffering, and but which I'd like to ask you about. But also, I know it's a tangential question, but then I also think about obviously how Jacob went down to Egypt, and Joseph obviously ended up as a very, very high figure in the court of Egypt, and Moses must have been deeply ingrained in the culture and the wisdom of Egypt. So I'm wondering if there's a story that's not being told here, which is about a wisdom that precedes the birth of the Hebrew culture, and how this longer, earlier culture is also influencing it. So there's two very separate questions there, but it's the role of Egypt in this word Egypt, but also the role of Egypt maybe in not just being the role of the slave master, but also the role of bringing wisdom. I wonder also.
Well, there's a lot of things you raised. So it is true about the name Egypt does come out of a sense of narrowness. I would say if we wanted to make a direct connection to what I've been talking about, then you could say that narrowing down and that narrowing down, that's what conceptualizing does. Every concept is a narrowing down like that. So if we're stuck in concepts, then we're stuck in Egypt. We're stuck in a very narrow way of seeing the world. So that sort of fits right away like that. Now, there's another phenomena which you're pointing toward, which is every culture and every civilization learn from the other civilizations that it's part of. So there's no doubt that the Hebrew people, when they left Canaan and then spent all this time in Egypt, that they were influenced by Egyptian culture and by what they saw around them, what that culture was teaching. And so one of the interesting, just even a little sidelight about that, we talked about Moses with the burning bush, but then at some point the whole people, after the exile from slavery, and the whole people are wandering in the wilderness, then they come back to the same place where the bush is, and then the whole Jewish people starts to get a revelation about the divine. And the first word of the revelation is Anochi. It says I, which is an Egyptian word. It's the Egyptian word for I.
Oh, wow.
Ani is I in Hebrew, and in Egyptian it was Anochi. And they're close. The words are related to each other because they're probably both Proto-Semitic languages. I mean, but the revelation of Sinai starts with an Egyptian word. So even that, pretty amazing, I think.
Yeah.
But that revelation, this is another way. So I talked about the burning bush with you, but the first revelation of Sinai, the group revelation, says, Anochi Yud-Heh Vaveh, I am Yud-Heh Vaveh. So if you understand Yud-Heh Vaveh as some God out there, then you could sort of say, as if the God out there is saying, I am Yud-Heh Vaveh, who brought you, I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. But Hebrew verse has no punctuation and no periods, so that same revelation could be understood that the sense of I am, that's what Yud-Heh Vaveh is. Anochi Yud-Heh Vaveh could be I am Yud-Heh Vaveh for you. Every I am of the universe is part of what we're calling Yud-Heh Vaveh. Yud-Heh Vaveh is what we call it. The experience itself is, because the other difference in Ehiyah and Yud-Heh Vaveh is what you call it. Ehiyah is the internal experience of being from the point of view of the first person, because that's what the grammar was of that word. If you have to call it something, okay, then you can call it a name. But and even the word I am, even the experience Ehiyah, it's not meant to be a word. It's pointing to the experience of being in the first person. So. And we still have a remnant of that in English. You can't use the verb to be in the first person. You don't say I be. You have to grab a whole different verb to get to this sense of I, because I am is not a word. It's an experience. It's the experience of amming. It's the experience of being. What you call it is another thing. Okay.
So, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that sentence is so crucial because it could be interpreted in a kind of exoteric, kind of mainstream way. There's a transcendent God, and that God was Yud-Heh Vaveh, and He, quote unquote, delivered us from Egypt with His outstretched arm, and however the quote is, I should know. But so it can so easily also be interpreted. It's the I am. It's our, as human beings, it's our capacity to open ourselves to isness, to the unfolding, to be present to the unfolding of being that can deliver us from...
Right, exactly right. So this opening line of the Ten Commandments, which also at the burning bush place, so it says, I am Yud-Heh Vaveh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, could be understood to say, the sense of an awakened I am, that's what God is. And it's awakening because that's what it is. That's what takes you out of Egypt, is the awakening, that the I is the divine. That takes you out of the narrow place. Now you're the eye of the universe.
and that I don't think that for me, I actually feel this is such a moment of excitement, because the lesson is that we, the first one basically transfers our powers and freedom to an external source whom we need to, obey and supplicate to in order to, find a favor with. And that then leads to political formations in our human society of the divine right of kings, of authoritarianism, of all forms. Whereas the latter opens up to a radical democracy, a radical empowerment of the self and the collective, as it's we who have the powers within us for our own emancipation, our own, not just spiritual, but in the full sense, the human, every element of the human experience to be emancipated. And, that's tremendously exciting.
Yeah, I would agree, it's tremendously exciting. One point I wanted to make was it took another 1,500 years, because this revelation was, I think, essentially misunderstood. I mean, the seeds of it are there in the difference between Ehiyah, which is the experience, and the Yud-Heh-Vav, which is the name for the experience, or what to call it. But so it took 1,500 years for this theology to evolve, that it's all God, everything is God, nothing but God. But the point I wanted to make in terms of what you just said was, it's a really good story. It's like, it can be really clear that this was not, I know we spent 90 minutes doing this. It's not such a complicated teaching per se, but it's not good enough to have a new way of looking at something as a concept. So as conceptually, it's just a nice idea. It's another idea. Maybe it's a better idea. I like this idea better. But the importance that I want to emphasize is just thinking about this stuff and then changing our beliefs and views and opinions based on thinking is going to leave us stuck still. And so the fundamental practice can't only rely, it's not that one shouldn't study and one shouldn't teach and one shouldn't read, but there is a fundamental practice implication, which is we need to start learning how to use this biological process called heart-mind to do something in addition to thinking. We're not going to be able to think our way out of the problem, because you still stay stuck with the fundamental programming if all you do is think about it. And then as soon as you stop thinking about it, you act selfishly again. We have to shift a certain amount of our behavior into observing rather than thinking. It's a really different way to use this body. It's something the body is capable of, but but when we're busy thinking, we don't observe much. We're mostly caught on reflecting on how to deal with what we observed for a split second. So the fundamental practice is to pay direct attention using other of our faculties to notice what's unfolding, and that has to include sort of witnessing language and how language impacts us by watching it do it as it's happening, and occupying the place of the witness while we do it rather than the thinker. So I want to emphasize the practice side of it, and that's why mystics, they did have a lot of thinking and writing, but mystical practice is more of a practice that allows one to actually have a different perspective. It's not just thinking about a different perspective. It's actually living in a different perspective.
Thank you for that, because it is of fundamental importance. I'd like to finish maybe with asking one question, which is, I guess, no problem. I'd just like to finish by asking this one question, which is a kind of a practical, it's also a personal thing, because this is something I'm working on in my life, which is, because as we ended the first part by saying that of course language is the problem, but the way out is not by throwing away language, and language of course is essential for us to create this beautiful world. So I'd like to ask you, how do we use language in this healing way, so that that we can align our mouths, our language, with not just our minds, but our whole bodies, in a way that brings healing to us and others.
Yeah, I like to talk about, when I talk about this with people, I talk about sacred thinking and sacred imagination. So when we're not paying attention, thinking is the fundamental default activity of the heart-mind, and it results in mundane thinking, which is influenced by, as it should be in some ways, by being self-centered and self-preoccupied and self-serving. So when we pay attention, what happens is the act of paying attention itself becomes a causal principle in the chain of cause and effect. And when one pays attention, what arises naturally, I would say sort of a higher class of thought, a higher class of language. So out of paying attention, we wind up being able to use language and words. You'll find that one finds that when one's paying attention, different thoughts arise when one's not paying attention. And not really higher, I like to call it sacred thinking and sacred imagination. It's a thinking that's infused with seeing the reality of interconnectivity. So if you see the reality of interconnectivity, the words come out differently. When you're not paying attention, they come out in the conditioned way that words usually work. So, but we have to use words. And the example, maybe one example that people could instantly connect to is, you think about something like poetry. In poetry, you use words to create imagery, but you use them in a different way. That's what probably makes poetry poetry. It's like you take the words, which are just tools, and use the tools to build something different. When you're not paying attention, all the tools are just hammers. You just shatter things. But so you build. Words are going to be a central feature of human experience forever. But there is a way to turn those words into sacred text, into sacred imagination, and so then the words are being influenced by the direct understanding and vision of interconnectivity. But we have to use words.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And we have to be selfish. To some degree, we need to be selfish. We need to, it's totally appropriate to use words to get enough food to eat, but not if it means stealing it from somebody else. Or not. Sometimes that's probably appropriate too, but.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really, I love how really what we're talking about overall is, for me, is very so nourishing, because what I rejected at an early age was the particularism or the parochialism, I guess, of the Judaism I experienced. But what you invite me back into is a Judaism that is a particular, in the sense of course, this is one way, one historical experience, but it's a way into the universal. Because Ehyeh or Yud-Heh Vav-Heh is not just the God of a particular. It is isness. It's being. It's So I'm very, very grateful, and as well, and of course, then as well as pointing us into such a rich path to take towards healing and towards love, ultimately.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
So, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Appreciate it.
It's been fun talking to you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.